All right, welcome back. Okay, this is going to be lecture 11, the punctuated equilibrium theory of agenda setting and policy change, and this is by Graham Boucher. Yeah, this is interesting stuff, right? So the entire concept here is that we can think of policy change as relatively static, right? Policy change sort of does the same thing over time, right? But the punctuated equilibrium model says like we'll get just flat, 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 and then there will be a big change, and then flat, 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 kind of like an EKG, right? And this comes from sort of the paleontologists slash evolutionary biologists, Niles Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould's work in sort of evolutionary biology is really fascinating stuff. But basically, what they found was that, like, as they looked through the fossil record, right, they saw basically static, right? There wasn't all that much evolutionary change over time. There wasn't that much change in like skeletal structure, skeletal size, or even sort of DNA structure or DNA changes, right? And instead, what they saw was this sort of punctuated model where you'll get static, basically like the same skeletal structure or genetic material over a long period of time, and then you'll get this sort of rapid change, right? And there are a couple reasons why they suggest this can happen. First, you can sort of get changes in the environmental system, right, or in your biosphere, or whatever it might be, right? So this could be like a new disease, it could be drought, it could be a new predator is introduced, all kinds of different stuff, right? So external stuff. But there's also internal stuff like random mutations, right? What we know from sort of evolutionary theory is that we're getting constant genetic mutations, right? But the vast majority of these are negative. They'll actually cause you to die faster and to have what's called reduced fecundity, the likelihood of bearing children, right? Or they're neutral, right? And so there's not really any change to the genetic structure or to like the physical specimen, etc. But very rarely, occasionally, because these sort of genetic changes are, from what we know, pretty static, right? They stochastically happen at about the same patterning level. However, there are a random few that are beneficial genetic variations, right? So while most are neutral or sort of bad, right? Occasionally, there will be a new random genetic mutation which will increase the likelihood of fecundity, right? Because strongest of the fittest, this isn't actually how evolution works. It's about fecundity, right? And so, yeah, so you have external and internal, and this can be played out in policy as well, right? We have external shocks, we have internal changes, so really interesting stuff. And the more you learn about sort of science, or if you get to graduate school and become a researcher, these sorts of things, it's worthwhile to get outside of your field and try and pick up ideas from other sciences that can be applied to your field, right? So, um, kind of really cool where the origin of punctuated equilibrium comes. All right, so we'll get back to sort of policy. They basically say like there's policy feedback loops, right? And you could have negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. And the negative feedback loops they emerge as a result of delegation, basically, of routine policy making to these sort of policy sub governments. And that's where we generally get sort of tinkering around the margins, which we've talked about before, right? However, when you get sort of a positive feedback, this usually is sort of a ground swelling or public opinion or something like that, maybe a mass shock. Um, this results when you get sort of mass political attention on some system-wide dimension or policy, right? And this is when you get this sort of punctuated equilibrium, where you will get a massive turnover in policy or a whole new direction or whatever, right? So for the most part, we get this delegatory negative feedback loop where we're just sort of delegating the power of policymaking to sort of sub-government institutions, right? But occasionally, when things are popping off, or when something's very popular, or there's been some exogenous shock, whatever it might be, this is when we tend to get this positive loop, and we'll get maybe mass change in the system, right? And this sort of ties on to earlier, I think it was like the first or second chapter of the whole book, where they sort of discuss how these marginal changes generally occur over time. But then when you get sort of an exiling of the policymakers in this realm, then you have room for new policy ideas, new policy space, et cetera, right? And they also really want to point out that, look, there's only so much room on the agenda, right? Like we kind of talked about this in the former chapter. There's 1,000 or more public social ills that we could conceivably try to fix, right? But first, government doesn't need to be involved in everything, probably. And then second, like there's only so much attention and eyeballs and space and all of this sort of stuff, time to write policy, to analyze policy, all of these sorts of things, right? Um, and when attention is high, however, that's when we're going to get these punctuated equilibriums. And I would point you to some other sort of literature in this realm. A very, very famous piece is Cox and McCubbins and their sort of police versus fire alarm model, right? Like most of the time, um, they're not policing anything, right? They're waiting for a fire alarm to go off before they give this problem attention, right? Or make tinkering to a policy, right? They can't just police everything constantly. And so this sort of it sort of is at least tangentially tied to this idea of punctuated equilibrium, and then Cox and McCubbin's police versus fire alarm model, right? All right. We're going to skip blah 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 to 11.4, disproportionate information processing and positive feedback cycles. And they basically say here the key insight is that patterns of policy change result from selective allocation of attention, right? We've touched on it a few times before, but it's important, right? We cannot give every issue equal time. And then they also say that this sudden influx of informational attention, or the entire sort of body politic becomes interested in some, I don't know, some policy subfield, whatever it might be, right? This will give high levels of attention from our policymakers, and it often can lead to over responding, right? And so it's interesting. They're saying like the negative feedback loop with the delegatory stuff is almost under responding at all times, right? You get tinkering and marginal changes and whatever it might be. But then when attention does hit a subject, we go the other direction and throw way too much response at it, and often too quickly, to look like they're doing something about the problem, which can cause issues because you didn't really analyze it correctly before you implemented the policy, right? So, yeah, there's a lot of little nuances here. Okay, section 11.5, positive feedback cycles and institutional choice. They're basically asking here, like, what does lead to growing public attention? And the first is exogenous shocks, right? A market failure, a war, a terrorist event, energy shifts, inflation, like whatever it might be, some shock occurs, right? And then second, a shift in media coverage, right? Maybe they decide to frame something completely differently, and then this gets the public to think differently about a problem. Um, okay. 11.6, policy entrepreneurs, venue shopping, issue framing, and policy change. So, the question they lay out in this section is, what does this theory of punctuated equilibrium tell us about interest groups, right? First, it suggests that they're probably more important than the sort of monolithic institutional approach, right? As the state, as this sort of singular body. interest groups are going to be incredibly important, especially in framing whether the public even thinks this particular sub policy is important, right? Number two, external outsider groups are vital to policy change. So generally, what you have is this sort of ossified system where, as we talked about in the earlier chapters, you'll get this high level group of sort of constellation of policymakers, whether it be from the government, NGOs, corporate interests, whatever. But once they've established themselves as the leader in that policy realm, they tend to stick. They tend to reduce the likelihood of alternative ideas. They tend to lead to marginal and nominal changes, right? However, when you get sort of this positive loop and we get attention on a new issue, oftentimes you'll get either a complete overhaul of the former policy subsystem, or you'll get a way more space for external groups that weren't really allowed to participate before, right? Because your model is shit, obviously, right? Like what's happening right now isn't working because the entire public is suddenly fascinated by how do we fix this. So you've lost your legitimacy, right? As those former that constellation I was talking about, and now there's a lot more space for new groups to come in and offer alternative ideas. Okay, and the third point they make here is venue shopping, right? By sort of coalitional groups or NGOs or those external actors we were talking about earlier. And this is the idea that you try to strategically move across these jurisdictions to try to secure some legislative change, right? And I actually think that they only singularly use the word legislative, and I think that this was way too restrictive, um, because we are obviously learning, right? At least in the modern period, since I don't know, since Bush two, um, that executive orders are becoming wildly more common and far more powerful, right? So that sort of gets all the way around the legislative branch. And we're also learning that, like, the judicial branch is very important, right? Because the Supreme Court can, in many ways, set policy, or say the federal appeals courts, or whatever it might be, right? And so we see actual targeting of particular courts, right? And the right, the conservatives tend to be very, very particular about trying, at least for like criminal and social issues, to hit the circuit in Abilene, Texas, right? Maybe the most conservative federal judge on the benches. This is where that sort of the stoppage of the abortifacient mifepristone, it came out of that court, and other sort of very, very right wing rulings came out of that court. Uh, for conservatives, when it comes to economic ideas and this, oh man, we'll talk about it in a second, but when it comes to economics, they usually go to the Dallas branch, right? Of the courts, right? And this is where sort of Johnson and Johnson's bullshit of trying to subsidiarize their baby powder department into this brand new legal entity, and then they declared bankruptcy, and now they're not on the hook for all of these sort of payouts for cancer patients, right? There's this game being played in those courts, right? And corporate entities know that they'll probably get a pro business ruling if they go to that Dallas court, right? On the other side, on the left, what we usually get is Washington D.C., which is a very liberal circuit, or sort of the West Coast circuit of Oregon, Washington, California, right? And so we know that there's this targeting of particular court systems depending on what your ideological preference is, right? Um, and we also know, like, if you can get the first ruling on this thing, whatever the policy might be talking about, you get that sort of first mover advantage that we've talked about in some of those economic games. First mover advantage doesn't sort of come into play in every situation, but many situations, if you can establish what is the legitimate argument, what are we even debating, all of these sorts of things, then you have an advantage, right? Okay. And then the fourth point they make here is that framing is really vital to whether we're in the negative loop process or the positive loop process, right? Okay, and then the final section, 11.7, empirical processes in punctuated equilibrium. I just wanted to point out, like, if you're interested in this stuff, the data, the most sort of well-regarded data set is the Comparative Agendas Project. It's a long-term longitudinal study of 14 nations and their sort of policy and sub-policy realms. Um, and then they offer some graphs sort of comparing steady versus punctuated. But what I would actually say is sort of throw that out and think of just a linear, right, which represents the normal sort of model versus an EKG, right, where you get flat and then a bump and then flat and then a bump, that sort of thing. That's more like sort of the punctuated equilibrium. Or if it's positive, like we just talked about with the linear set, what you'll see is a stepwise progression, right? It'll be flat, 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 and then you'll get a punctuation to a new level, flat, 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 punctuation to a new level, and so you get almost this step situation. Okay, that's it for chapter 11. I will be back with chapter 12 as soon as I can. Thanks for being here.